So, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the WTFinance podcast. And on today's episode, I'm happy to be hosting Dr Anas Alhaji, who's a world-renowned energy markets expert, researcher, and author. Anas is currently the managing partner at Energy Outlook Advisors and was the former chief economist of NGP Energy Capital Management. So, Anas, thank you so much for joining the podcast. And just on to my first question, obviously, the past few years in energy has been pretty crazy. Lots of, I guess, geopolitical things that have occurred. How would you describe the current state of the markets today?
Well, crazy, that's good enough. The problem we have today is literally we have a panic in the market on all sides. And when you have a panic in the market, it's very hard even to tell what tomorrow is about and what the future is about. We have major issues, whether in Europe or around the world. And those issues are affecting even the other sources of energy that include renewable energy, everything else, simply because now we see the same countries that want to ban oil or stop oil investment, they are begging for it. We see countries that want to go for renewable energy, all of a sudden they want natural gas and they want oil. So it is crazy.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, obviously the past few months or only the past month, it feels like longer. We've seen the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And I guess a lot of politicians like to blame, the inflation or the price increase we've seen on that. But I think I've heard you say that it started a lot before that, as you mentioned, transition trying to go to renewables too quickly, less investment. So yeah, I'm not sure if you can talk about that a bit more.
Sure. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, we already had an energy crisis in Europe and we had shortages in China and India. So the energy crisis started way earlier, and there were many reasons for that. Even without the invasion of Ukraine, whatever we've seen in the fourth quarter of 2021 would have continued anyway. But the invasion of Ukraine and the fear that we are going to have gas shortages, oil shortages, kind of masked that. But one of the main reasons for the crisis in Europe and partly in India and China, that yes, we have serious problems with environmental issues. Whether you believe in climate change or not, we have a major issue in big cities in the United States, around the world, that big cities, even in the Middle East, they are highly polluted. So the level of pollution in those cities, you look at China, India, etc., is really bad. I mean, all of us travel around the world. When we get out of the plane, we feel it in our eyes. I mean, just immediately we see that there is a serious problem. So whether you believe in climate change or not, it doesn't matter. We have cities that are polluted. We need to reduce the emissions. We need to reduce that pollution. But the problem is, to approach that, we need to balance three things. We need to balance the environmental security with energy security, with economic security. And if you don't balance that, you lose all of them. So you want to go all the way for environmental security, you are going to lose energy security. If you lose energy security, you lose environmental security. And in the process, you lose economic security. So we need a plan, a long-term plan, where we balance all those three. If you go extreme on any one of them, you are going to end up with problems. If you say, well, I'm going to go after economic security, well, you just sacrificed both. You sacrificed environmental security and you sacrificed energy security. So we need to get a balance among those three.
Do you think a balance is possible, or is it like a pipe dream?
Well, it is pipe dream. And the reason why, because one of the problems, let me talk about the United States in particular. One of the problems in the United States when it comes to energy policy is that the presidential term is only 4 years. This is just by the time a president gets to the office and warm up to the next election, it's over. And that one of the major threats to energy security in countries where the presidential term is short, because the president cannot even get his agenda done within that period. And then if you have a change, then the agenda will change again. We've seen it with Trump, we've seen it with Biden. So politics is kind of ruining all of this, not necessarily what the politicians wish as much as the system itself.
Yeah, and you could say, especially in the US, that every 2 years between that, there's midterms, and a lot of the times they
Absolutely,
lose power. So there's further
absolutely.
conflict there. Definitely. Would you say so? Obviously, if we look back at 2020, sort of really the drop in oil and sort of other energy started with the Saudi Arabia and Russia sort of oil war that went into COVID and went to negative oil prices. Do you see, is that really the start of maybe a shift? Because what we saw is, I guess, a lot of shale companies going out of business, becoming bankrupt, and now there's that less incentive to actually invest into new oil because of that concern, as you mentioned, of will
Really,
they allow
it
us to do
really
it?
started. It started in 2014, 2015. So it started way
Okay.
earlier because the market crashed at that time. Shale got exposed at that time, but there were multiple factors that played in the last 7, 8 years in the current crisis, and the lower investment and the inability for supply to meet demand even in the coming years. Aside from low prices and low returns, and therefore investors are not attracted to these things, we have a lot of hype that came out of shale and mainly came out of the International Energy Agency that was talking about this massive explosion in shale production that no need to invest in oil anywhere in the world except in the United States because shale is going to take over of everything. So we have this hype that scared investors. So the International Energy Agency was one of the main factors in reducing investment. And they did this throughout the Trump presidency. Trump loses to Biden. The second day, immediately the second day, they change their tone and they start talking about renewable energy and carbon neutrality, net zero, and that's why some people would love to see Trump coming back, just to see how the International Energy Agency is going to switch back.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's well, I think they're probably mostly funded by the US. I'm not sure if they are, but I'm sure a lot of I've seen a lot of other ones are mostly funded by the US. So maybe that's they want to make sure they keep getting that funding.
So correct. So this hype kind of played the role, and then we've seen the hype of renewable energy and the hype of electric vehicles, whether the International Energy Agency or all others who are benefiting from the subsidies to those sectors. And we've seen their profits basically talking about the end of oil, peak oil demand, etc., which was completely nonsense and has been already proven to be completely wrong, but it did affect investment. So there were multiple factors that reduced investment in oil and gas, and now everyone is paying the price.
Yeah, definitely. And it's as I was saying, you just need a few things to happen geopolitically. A few people who previously provided oil not to do that, and it just throws the market into pandemonium, basically.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Which is what we've seen. So, it's interesting there. You mentioned renewables, and I think I'm not sure. Obviously you're more focused on energy, but do you think it's possible to get a 100% renewable economy? Because my concern is more the commodity costs. We've already seen lithium, we've seen nickel, we've seen all these commodities.
Yes, we have many issues here. And the first issue is renewable is intermittent, and the storage and batteries, basically, the technology of storage and batteries still lag behind. So unless we have cheap storage that can cover all the intermittent energies, then it is intermittent energy. And then, of course, we have the energy intensity of those two compared to nuclear or compared to oil and gas, even to coal, if you wanted to focus on coal. So we still have many problems, and we cannot. And we still remember what happened on September 6th in the UK. On September 6th, that's where, if you want to date the energy crisis as it appeared to the media at that time, on September 6th, just the wind stopped. And all of a sudden, they would have ended up in power shortages if not depending on coal and natural gas. And natural gas prices went through the roof that day and been going up since then. So wind stopped. What do you do? So we do have some serious problems. And this idea that we are going to go to 100% renewable has other problems. If you study energy security, and I'm talking about energy security, everything be written about energy security forever, you will see that energy security has certain principles. And one of the main principles of energy security, if you want to be energy secure, of course, then your national security your national issues are secured, and then your economy is secured. So if you want to talk about energy security, the first principle of energy security is to diversify energy sources. And going to renewable energy, you are going in the opposite direction. It's concentration. The second rule is you have to diversify your imports. And if everyone depends on renewable energy, then you are importing only electricity, and that's it. So you are not even diversifying the imports in this case, and most likely it is from 1 or 2 countries. So we have some serious problems. The third one is you want lower price volatility. And look what happened just in the last few months. I mean, electricity prices went through the roof. The strange thing when we talk about renewables is the greener the country, the higher the price of electricity, which is very strange. But here I would like to emphasize a very important point. We do need all energy sources. So do we need solar and wind and other renewables? Yes, we do need them. Do we need technology to diversify our energy sources? Yes, we do. Do we need technology to diversify our transportation sector and electric vehicles? Yes, we do. We got to be wise about it so we can have the economic security, the environmental security, and the economic security at the same time. Otherwise, we are going to jump just from crisis. And people do not realize that the amount of time and money the taxpayer lose just because of those committees and the meetings and the hearings and all this stuff are trying to solve those problems is in billions. These are very expensive things, very expensive policies, and most of them are done quickly, and we pay the price for that later on. So we need a sound policy where we have this mix of energy sources with a balance or a balanced approach where we don't jump from a crisis to another.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen is, as you mentioned there, we need consistent energy, and a lot of the countries, especially in Europe, have moved to gas, which has been that consistent energy. But now, with what's happening in Russia, links back to what you said, that energy security, they basically are sponsoring this war because they can't actually feasibly get off it without sacrificing the economics of their countries.
Absolutely. And basically, they are in an energy crisis simply because they violated the rules of energy security. They depended more on gas, and they depended on one country instead of diversification, which was the basic rule of it. At the same time, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot eat your cake and have it at the same time, which means that telling the Russians, you know what, I hate you, I don't want you, I'm going to punish you, but I need your gas.
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen recently with how they're saying they want to, people to pay them in rubles. We haven't seen that impact. I think they're mentioning it could happen in a few weeks where the contracts need to be paid. That could be another catalyst for further, issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Perfect. So I've sort of listened to a few of your interviews, and you mentioned how you like analyzing history and seeing how the past has reacted to certain events. Are there any examples of maybe in the past where people haven't invested in, oil and gas and energy, and it's really impacted them?
Yes, in fact, one of the this is kind of a myth, but I am completely convinced that the crisis in the 70s happened exactly because of this reason. The embargo just was the icing on the cake, in a sense, just kind of, or the umbrella that covered them all. And politicians in the West used it to cover all their mistakes and the policy failures. But if you look at even most of the pictures of the gasoline lines that are being published today in various newspapers and news outlets saying this is the embargo of 1973 and look at the gasoline line. If they go back and investigate the picture, those pictures are either 1 or 2 years earlier than the embargo. Why? Because there was energy crisis that existed way before the embargo. And we have a lot of evidence. And on my Twitter account, basically, I have long threads and with all the newspaper articles and magazines and others, basically to take care, to cover these things and to show that the crisis existed way before the embargo and the gasoline lines existed before the embargo.
So that's interesting. So you mentioned there, obviously, the oil crisis. And then after that, we saw, massive inflation in most economies in the next 10, 15 years. I guess, is that something that, I know you're an economist as well, do you potentially predict that, or what's your thoughts on maybe the future?
We are heading for energy crisis no matter what, and this energy crisis is going to be unlike any energy crisis in the past. It's going to be very big, it's going to be large, it's going to cover the world. The suffering is going to be massive for several reasons, because the crisis in the 70s happened because of lack of investment while demand was going through the roof. We've seen part of the decline in investment happened because oil companies, because of the independence of the oil producers at that time, and some countries like Iraq and Libya nationalized their oil resources, and they kicked the Western companies out, etc. So the companies realized that there is no tomorrow, and because they realized there was no tomorrow, they stopped investing. They just stayed there, produced as much as they can until the final day came in and they left. So we have a gap in investment of several years that led to the crisis of the 70s. And then the embargo happened, but the embargo, if you want to look at the benefits of the embargo, one of the benefits of it is because it was a political event, it instigated nationalism in the United States and Europe in a way where people cooperated with the government programs. And they said, you know what, those Arabs, the media was full of those articles and this stuff. We don't want to be controlled by the Arabs. Then we are going to do this, we are going to do this. And they embarked on massive programs that reduced demand substantially in this case. So that's the whole story of the 70s. Now we have lower investment. That's going to continue because of the green programs, carbon neutrality, etc. on one side. And then because of the Russia-Ukraine, this is a major event, by the way, is going to in the energy history. And the reason why it is a major event is not because of any cut or because of the embargo on Russian oil or gas or the impact of the war itself. Simply Putin single-handedly delayed the green policies in Europe for 7-8 years without even intending to do so. How? Basically, in several ways. One of them is now everyone is scrambling for gas, so they are going to depend more on US gas instead of the other projects. People do not realize that the substitution between oil and renewables is very limited, and in Europe is almost zero, simply because oil is rarely used to generate electricity in Europe. So oil is safe on this side, so it's going to be the gas, but they need the gas. It's coming from other countries. But on the other side, we've seen now rich countries and poor countries around the world shifting subsidies from green energy and electric vehicles to subsidize food and fuel, because simply the result of the war was higher fuel prices and higher food prices, and governments are worried about re-elections. So they are shifting subsidies, and therefore all the green energy projects got delayed.
I think that's one thing I've realized is that, a lot of these green, transition to renewables, it's important, but it's easy to say when in good times, in good economic times, when there's not much volatility and conflict. But when it's the conflict, and, you mentioned their energy prices, they affect especially lower demographics a lot more. There's sort of asymmetrical impact on people because, if you're poorer, most of your money will go towards this. Whereas if you're richer, it doesn't affect you as much. So there's that massive concern there as well.
We have evidence from around the world, and especially from countries like India. When the government of India lifted the subsidies and then start adding taxes, we've seen poor families going to the old mine shafts, the coal mines, and literally digging the coal by hand and burning it. We've seen them going to forests basically and cutting trees. We've seen them going and using animal dung for cooking and heating and all this stuff because as a fuel. So all of a sudden they raised the cost trying to improve the environment, and it did exactly the opposite in this case. They wanted biofuel, and what we've seen in several countries, all of a sudden forests are on fire. How it happened, no one knows. But all of a sudden they cleared the forest, and biofuel harvest basically or planting happened there. The plants that are needed for biofuel are planted in the place where the forests are being burned. And there are enough evidence to show, especially in Brazil, that's been done on purpose. So now you want to help the environment by having biofuel, but you are burning the forest, which is the lung of the world, to have biofuel. So we are having some serious problems because of that.
Do you see it potentially could be a catalyst for further investment in the future, and I guess in renewables, nuclear, hopefully, and then other things as well? Or do you think, and I guess the risk there is it's going to take, takes years and lots of capital expenditure to actually getting results from that?
Well, it takes years anyway, but will we see a change, for example, back toward oil and gas? I think we are going to see a change toward natural gas in particular. And I think investment in natural gas is going to increase. Everyone is realizing that LNG right now is really a good solution to save the countries, simply because you can take it just like oil anywhere. You can take that tanker and deliver natural gas. So I think we are going to see a change of heart toward natural gas in particular. Toward oil, one of the main issues we are going to see is that dependence on oil is not going to decline like a lot of people are thinking, or the International Energy Agency is thinking. The growth in oil demand is going to slow down, but oil demand itself is not going to decline. We are going to see growth year over year for the next few decades, no matter what. And the problem is with that lower investment, we don't have enough in this case. But the big crisis is not going to happen because of this lack of investment. The big crisis is going to happen because the green policies are not going to deliver. And when I say they are not going to deliver, simply because in every scenario, when you look at the IEA, for example, and you look at their forecast, they are assuming this country is going to have this policy and they are going to implement it, and here are the results. And they assume 100% success. Well, the problem is we have thousands of books and articles being written in the last 100 years or so talking about policy failure. All of a sudden, when it comes to green energy, the policy of the government is going to be a major success, unlike everything in history. Just the green policies are going to succeed. Everything else is a failure. So we know that the green policies are going to have limited impact. And if they are going to have limited impact, then the demand for oil and gas is going to increase. And that's not accounted, it's not being accounted anywhere in any forecast. And how we are going to meet that? So we are already short, even with the current forecast. So what's going to happen with the green policy failure in this case, where we are going to get that oil and gas?
Yeah, it's scary to think. So I guess, I know it's hard to predict what happens in the future, and I'm sure none of us have predicted the last few things, but I guess, what do you see occurring maybe, by 2025, 2026, next 5 years or so? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the crisis already started. It's going to deepen in the next few years. I mean, think about it this way. One of the problems that we are seeing is that between the hype of shale and the hype of the carbon neutrality, we are seeing the major oil producers within OPEC behaving differently from the past. They are taking their money from oil, and instead of reinvesting in oil and gas, they are taking it and investing in somewhere else. And therefore, they are not going to invest in massive increase in spare capacity to meet the future demand. They are taking their money. They are even investing in electric vehicles like Lucid, for example, or others. They already invested in Tesla once. Because we scared them, they are not even using the oil revenues to expand capacity. And that's going to make the problem worse.
Yeah, so it definitely sounds like it's next few years. So basically what you're saying is that there's going to be quite a, are we going to have to go back to rationing, do you think?
It's very hard to kind of make a conclusion on that, but I would like to add one more point here. Because we scared the hell out of them because of that hype and because of political statements from Joe Biden and others in Europe, what some countries are doing, say, they are literally adopting a policy, which I call it the Fox policy, to outfox everyone else. And what they are doing, basically saying, look, you don't want my oil because you want to go for electric vehicles, go for it. I want to make sure that the body of the electric vehicle is made from my oil. So I'm going to export the oil embedded in something else. And therefore, once those policies do not deliver, and I need more oil in the future, that oil does not exist because it's already been converted to some other materials. And the only way I can get it, if I pay a very high price that compensate for the profit from making that material. So we have a major issue here too, because oil producers are changing their behavior too. So aside from the fact they are taking the oil revenues and investing in everything else, they are investing in converting that oil to something else so it can be exported under a different material.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, do you see, because obviously, I guess in France, who knows what happens in the election, but it's Le Pen versus Macron. And I guess the only way that Le Pen could potentially win is if, she gets people to rise against the increase in costs, which we've seen. And I guess, in the US, there's also the midterms as well. I guess, do you see there's the potential that all this increases in prices could lead to the populism that I guess maybe we saw in the US in 2016 and potentially in other countries as well?
Absolutely. We've seen it before. I mean, look, even when President Carter lost, I mean, of course, there were some politics related to Iran, but still the inflation and high energy prices played a big role in his defeat. So we've seen it before, and it's going to happen again. But the problem is, if we end up with the change where the far right basically wins, people do not realize that this comes in favor of OPEC plus, because the far right, especially in Europe, is aligned with Putin in one way or the other, and Putin is still part of OPEC plus, and OPEC plus still supporting Putin. So that comes to their advantage, and therefore, what consuming countries are going to do in this case? They are not going to go for renewable energy, as some people think. But again, renewable energy is going to affect gas. It's not going to affect the oil. And if you go for electric vehicles, no matter whatever the government, whatever amount of money you have, the impact of electric vehicles in the coming years on oil demand is not as much as the profits of electric vehicles are predicting. And therefore, even if all the stars are aligned for electric vehicles, and we end up with hundreds of millions of vehicles on the road in the coming years, and I believe we are going to have major increase, but the idea here is the impact of it on oil demand is not as much as they are claiming, and therefore I still need that demand no matter what. And if I don't have that supply, then what I'm going to do?
Yeah, definitely. I guess we've seen recently as well that, especially in the US, they've been looking for maybe the lesser of two evils. So they've been trying to get a deal with Tehran and in Iran, as well as maybe Venezuela. So it's almost like this shifting between different people.
I have a special view on this, by the way. So first of all, I don't think the deal with Tehran has anything to do with high oil prices. The deal with Tehran, even when Biden was a candidate, he promised that he would bring back the deal, and oil prices were low at that time. And this deal just been delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. So that's number one. Number two, the amount of oil that Iran can export is already in the market no matter what. So even if we have a deal tomorrow, it's the same amount of oil, and therefore the impact that some people think is there is not going to be there. So let's put Iran aside. Venezuela can add probably about 400 to 500,000 barrels a day within a very short period. All they got to do basically is get some diluent basically to dilute the heavy oil so they can export it. So they can add about only 400 or 500,000, and that's it. That's all their capability. But regardless, there is a suspicion that some of the Russian oil that used to come to the United States was a Venezuelan oil, no matter what. And probably going back to Venezuela was to secure that oil in one way or the other that was coming to the US by the Russians.
Yeah, I found that interesting. As you said, it's being bought by someone, but just at a discount. So, it could even be one of the OPEC countries buying from someone else and then selling it on, as you said there.
It could be. I think the Russians played the game, and they played it perfectly. And I think they are going to play it now, because one of the issues that people are talking about now, how Russia is going to sell its oil mixed with other oils. So if you mix it with other oil with certain percentages, you can claim it is not Russian oil, although a percentage of it is Russian oil.
Yeah, it's crazy how they try to play the games. And I guess it's trying to look like they're fighting at the forefront, but I guess in the background, it's, as you mentioned there, it's trying to do whatever they can to keep the economies running.
Well, it's not about Russia. It's not about policy, really. These are markets, and markets are so powerful. Markets overcome religion. Markets overcome government policy. That's why government policies are ruined, because markets are more powerful. That's why people sin, simply because markets are so powerful. They are tempting, and therefore they tempt even the religious people to break the rules of their religion, simply because the reward from the market is massive, and that's why people sin. So that's what markets basically are. It's not kind of a Putin policy or anyone's policy. That's what you do in markets. You see an opportunity and you do it.
Yeah, and I guess with the continued globalization, we've seen that they've become even more powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess, are there any maybe misconceptions that you see people having about energy markets? I'm sure you talk to a lot of people.
A lot of them, basically. I mean, this is one of the, of course, there are too many to talk about, but the idea that we have to, if we punish the oil companies today and we force them to lower prices, or we impose an excise tax on them because they got money that they don't deserve, etc., and they are making tons of money, etc. This is a misconception, because all you got to do, if you look at the rate of return in the oil industry, is really low. If you look at the capital invested versus the return, is really low. If those people are after companies that are making tons of money, they should be after Apple and Amazon, etc. They are the ones who are making tons of money. And not only that, I mean, who is the ultimate dictator in the world today? Give me a name.
Jeff Bezos, maybe Musk.
No, the ultimate dictator is Google.
Yeah.
Google is the ultimate dictator and has nothing to do with oil. I mean, it controls our life in so many ways, okay? And yet they are among the richest and the biggest companies in the world today, and they can dictate probably indirectly or indirectly. We already seen investigations basically about the influence of those companies on elections. So the idea here, it's not oil that is dictating things. It's not oil companies that are the most profitable, or they are making tons of money. It's the other companies, but they get the bad reputation anyway.
It's the lowest fruit, maybe lowest hanging fruit, easiest to
absolutely
like tobacco in the past, I guess. But yeah, this is really interesting. So I guess if we go back to maybe investors and people who are interested in this, I've heard you mention on an interview saying that, you know, you think that energy investment in energy is maybe one of the biggest opportunities coming up in the next couple of years. I guess without it being an advice, what are you thinking in terms of, is it going to be companies? Is it going to be like a spot prices? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the issues is that if we end up with shortages like I am predicting, then we are going to end up with high prices. If we end up with high prices, then the cash flow for those companies is going to be huge and for a long time. And it's going to be better than tech, better than any other companies, etc. At the same time, we've seen this before. If we end up with even with a recession and everything tank, and then we have a recovery, the demand for oil basically is going to continue like before the recession. But we already seen OPEC in particular, and now OPEC Plus, of course, cutting production even during a recession to increase prices. So in a sense, we already have a floor set for them, while the tech companies and everyone else, they don't have a floor. So that's another factor to consider, even if we end up with a recession.
It does seem like the first time, I guess you could link it to diamonds, where there's always been a floor and they've like really prevented, I guess, the supply of it going into the world to reduce prices. You know, you could see that happening to, I guess, oil as well.
Well, absolutely, but we don't want to relate it to diamond, because diamond is more controlled than oil in so many ways.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, as you mentioned there, do you think, I guess the only thing stopping this maybe from these energy companies making massive amounts of money will be potentially government's regulation? Do you see that?
That's always the case. So we are going to see that. But the problem is, the more regulation they have and the tighter things are, the higher the price. So they are shooting themselves in the foot. Government have to realize that we have a major crisis coming. We don't have enough supply. And if they don't encourage the industry to increase supply now, this is going to be a crisis with no control. Politicians do not realize another problem. companies can move their capital and move their headquarters too and just go somewhere else. I mean, if they got really stuck and they cannot do anything because of those regulations, they just go somewhere else. And many countries around the world, they still have a lot of oil, they still have a lot of gas, and they are happy to host them.
Yeah, there's been a few examples of the big players, moving from certain countries because they've been, they've had lawsuits and other things like that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess, are there any indicators that you're watching when, or maybe statistics or anything like that, that you're keeping an eye out at the moment to see when this, I guess, inflection point occurs?
Well, one of the issues, of course, everyone is worried about a recession right now. So we are looking at the macro variables right now, whether inflation and unemployment, business activities on one side, and what the Fed and central banks are going to do on the other. The lockdown in China basically is something big, and whether it's going to continue, whether it's going to be spread worldwide. So that's another indication. The other indication is whether we are going to see any reaction from Russia, where basically two reactions. One of them, whether they are going to stop or reduce their exports of oil and gas to Europe as a form of punishment, or whether we are going to see some serious cyber attacks on energy infrastructure in Europe and the United States and other countries. Because one of these strange things is we haven't seen this yet. And that means either Putin is happy with the performance of his army so far, and he is not really in the corner as some Western media is showing, or this is coming. And we already seen it in May 2021, when a Russian group, or at least some Russian-related group somewhere, basically halted the flow of the Colonial pipeline. And we lost a massive amount of products in the Northeast. And they were not able to solve the problem until they paid them. And they paid them with the approval of the US government. So that's another thing to watch. The fourth point is we are watching the development in the Middle East right now, and in Pakistan. As you know, there is a change in government, and there are these things going on right now in Yemen, trying to see whether there will be a change in Yemen, as some people are predicting. So these are some other political events in the Middle East that may reshape the energy markets. For Yemen, for example, Yemen is an oil producer, and Yemen is an LNG exporter. But we are not seeing any oil out of it. We are not seeing any LNG exports out of it. A peaceful transition in Yemen basically will lead to increase in oil exports and LNG exports. Again, about the Middle East, we have the Iran deal, whether we are going to end up with a deal or not. Iran is not going to be a big factor in the short run, but in the long run is going to be, Iran can replace a large portion of Russian gas in Europe, whether in the form of LNG or piped gas. So Iran is a big factor in this case too. So Pakistan, Iran, Yemen in the Middle East.
A lot of things to watch. It seems like, as you said
Absolutely.
before, we keep saying it's crazy times, lots of things happening. So Nas, thank you so much for joining the podcast. And I guess this one's my last question. What's one message that you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
Well, the message is we have to be reasonable when it comes to climate change and energy policy. And we need to balance energy policy with environmental policy, with economic policy, and to say it differently, as I said it earlier, we need to balance energy security with environmental security, with economic security. And I think we can achieve climate goals in the long run if we do that balance.
Yeah, and I think, I guess, maybe one good thing about what we've seen over the past few months is maybe people, it'll be a slower transition to make sure you have that security rather than trying to go straight to renewables and potentially.
I don't like the idea of slower transition, because slower relative to what? Yeah. I mean, we don't have anything to measure it to. It's just that we have some crazy politicians who want to jump the ladder, the whole ladder, instead of going step by step. And that was crazy. And everyone was waiting for a crisis because they are going to fall on their face. And they did fall on their face. So probably we got to be more wise about approaching this, rather than, it's not really a slower transition, because there is nothing to measure it to.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess I'm a proponent of nuclear power, but I don't really know anything about it. So probably not something I can talk about for too long. But yeah, thank you so much again.
You're
I
welcome.
know that you run a website. I think it's Ataka, which is sort of an energy news site. Do you have any other resources that you look at as
Well,
well?
I mean, I put a lot of stuff on my Twitter account, which is my first name, my last name, Anas Alhaji, Anas Alhajji, and I have my own website, which I haven't updated in a while now, but still have a lot of materials. Then I do work for Attaqa. Attaqa basically is the only media, energy-focused media platform in Arabic. And there are a lot of people who work in this organization, and I just help them as an expert in energy, basically just guide them through some materials that they have difficulties understanding it. But here I would like to mention to the viewers and listeners that when you go to Twitter in particular, use the translate function when you see another language. There is wealth of information in other languages you are missing on if you don't use the translate function. So all you get to do just push translate, and it shows you the translation in your own language, wherever you are. And if there is a link, on Chrome, for example, all you get to do just change the language on it, and you see the article in another language. So use the translation.
Yes, definitely. And I've used it and it works. And yeah, there's a lot of good stuff on there. So, Anas, thank you again. I'll put all the
You're
links in the
welcome.
description so people can see that. But yeah, all the best.
Thank you very much. It was
Thanks.
a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.